Every nation has its heroes, but buried in its soil are the men who nearly tore it apart. These aren't villains from comic books. These are real people, who wore power like armor and left behind scars that still haven't healed, from treason to tyranny, cover-ups to crusades. These are the top villains of U.S. history. Andrew Jackson is a name that splits American memory like a crack through marble. To some, he is the embodiment of populist democracy, the man who gave voice to the common white man, battled banks, and stood as a symbol of rugged American determination. But to others, he is a genocidal tyrant, the architect of Native American removal, and a slave-owning authoritarian who abused power with impunity. Born in 1767 in the Carolinas to Irish immigrant parents, Jackson's early life was marked by violence and loss. He was orphaned during the Revolutionary War and carried a lifelong scar on his face from a British officer's sword. These experiences hardened him. He grew into a man of deep grudges, quick tempers, and an unwavering will. By the War of 1812, Jackson had become a national hero. His defeat of the British in the Battle of New Orleans catapulted him into fame. To many Americans, he was the frontier warrior who had saved the nation. But his brutality was also evident. He led campaigns against Native Americans in Florida, most notably against the Seminoles, burning villages and executing prisoners. Jackson rode this popularity into politics. He lost the presidency in 1824 in what he called a corrupt bargain, then won in 1828 in a landslide, becoming the 7th president of the United States. His inauguration was chaotic. Thousands of common folk flooded the White House, breaking china and furniture in what elite observers called a mob scene. Jackson, however, saw it as democracy in action. Once in office, Jackson wielded executive power like a sword. He vetoed more bills than all previous presidents combined. He dismantled the Second Bank of the United States, which he saw as a corrupt institution that favored the wealthy elite. His supporters cheered. His enemies called him King Andrew. But the darkest and most enduring stain on Jackson's legacy is the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Jackson's belief in American expansion, vision of a white man's republic stretching from sea to sea, left no room for the sovereignty of native peoples. Under his administration, tribes were forced to sign treaties, relinquishing ancestral lands. Those who resisted were removed by force. The Trail of Tears, where tens of thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole were marched westward, stands as one of the most brutal episodes in U.S. history. Families were torn apart. Thousands died from exposure, starvation, and disease. Jackson defended the policy as necessary for progress, but its legacy is one of dispossession and death. Jackson was also a staunch supporter of slavery. He owned hundreds of enslaved people across his lifetime and violently suppressed slave rebellions. He believed slavery was essential to the Southern economy and fought any attempts to limit its expansion. Yet paradoxically, Jackson remains a towering figure in American politics. He helped birth the modern Democratic Party and expanded political participation for white men. His image adorned a $20 bill for decades. Presidents from Lincoln to Trump have cited him as a political inspiration. This duality, hero and villain, Democrat and despot, defines Jackson's place in history. He reshaped the presidency, shifted political power from elites to the masses, and left a legacy of populism that still reverberates today. But he also inflicted profound suffering, tore apart native nations, and governed with an iron will that bordered on authoritarianism. To understand Andrew Jackson is to confront the contradictions of America itself: liberty and tyranny, inclusion and exclusion, progress and violence. He was a product of his time and a shaper of it. And his story remains a stark reminder that the hands which build democracies can also destroy lives. His political ideology, known as Jacksonian democracy, preached equality for the common man, but only if that man was white and male. He expanded suffrage for poor white men, while excluding women, Native Americans, and African Americans. Jackson was not just a president, he was a symbol of an era, one fueled by manifest destiny, racial exclusion, and frontier expansion. Jackson's war on the national bank deeply altered America's economic landscape. He believed that a centralized bank represented elite control over the working man. In a dramatic move, he withdrew federal deposits from the bank and placed them into local pet banks, destabilizing the economy. The resultant panic of 1837 plunged the country into a depression, one that devastated working-class Americans, the very people Jackson claimed to represent. Throughout his presidency, Jackson clashed with the Supreme Court. When the court ruled in favor of the Cherokee Nation in Worcester v. Georgia, affirming their right to remain on their lands, Jackson reportedly defied the ruling, saying, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." This audacious defiance of judicial authority showcased his authoritarian streak. He was not merely a product of his violent times. He was an amplifier of them. Duels, executions, and power plays were not just tactics, they were pillars of his character. Jackson carried bullets in his body from duels, and even once killed a man in a pistol contest over a personal insult. To his supporters, These were signs of honor. To his critics, they were signs of savagery. After leaving office in 1837, Jackson retired to his Tennessee plantation, the Hermitage, where he continued to exert influence over Democratic politics. He remained unapologetic until the end. He once said, "I have only two regrets. I didn't shoot Henry Clay, and I didn't hang John C. Calhoun." Andrew Jackson died in 1845, but his impact endures. Monuments, banknotes, and political ideologies still echo his name. Debates over his legacy continue to rage. Should he be celebrated as a champion of the people or condemned as a brutal authoritarian? The answer, like Jackson himself, remains tangled in the contradictions of American history. For in Jackson's America, liberty came hand in hand with oppression, and in his legacy, we find the blueprint for both populist revolution and the dark undercurrents it can unleash. 2. Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis, the man who would lead a breakaway nation built on slavery, remains one of the most polarizing figures in American history. Hailed by Confederates as a patriot and martyr, condemned by Unionists as a traitor and defender of human bondage, Davis's life tells the tragic story of the Confederacy's rise and fall. But it also raises difficult questions about loyalty, power, and the ideological foundation of a nation divided by race. Born in 1808 in Kentucky and raised in Mississippi, Davis was the youngest of 10 children in a wealthy slave-owning family. He was educated at West Point and served in the U.S. Army before marrying the daughter of future President Zachary Taylor. Davis's early years were marked by ambition, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to Southern values, especially the institution of slavery. After a brief military career, Davis entered politics, serving in the U.S. House of Representatives and later the Senate. He quickly gained a reputation as a skilled orator and an unrelenting advocate for states' rights. But beneath his political philosophy was a clear moral stance. He believed that slavery was not only constitutional but also divinely sanctioned. Davis's support for slavery wasn't pacified, was ideological. He saw the Southern way of life as superior, rooted in a paternalistic hierarchy, where white men governed over an agricultural empire built by enslaved labor. He rejected abolitionists as radicals and believed the federal government had no right to interfere with what he called the state's domestic institutions. When war erupted in 1861, Davis was chosen to lead the Confederate States of America. Though not universally popular even in the South, he was seen as a steady and experienced, articulate, and he was inaugurated as president of the Confederacy in Montgomery, Alabama, and later in Richmond, Virginia. But Davis was no Lincoln. Where Lincoln inspired, Davis often alienated. Where Lincoln adapted, Davis clung rigidly to principle. He believed in strong executive power, but his leadership style was marked by inflexibility, micromanagement, and frequent clashes with his own generals, most famously with Joseph E. Johnston. He placed too much faith in loyalty and not enough in military competence. His support for figures like Braxton Bragg, despite repeated failures, cost the Confederacy dearly. Meanwhile, his inability to unify the various Southern states under a cohesive strategy led to infighting and inefficiency. Davis was also woefully unprepared for the economic realities of war. Under his leadership, the Confederacy failed to industrialize or manage inflation. Food shortages, conscription riots, and dissent grew rampant across the South. He responded by expanding executive power, suspending habeas corpus, jailing dissenters, and imposing martial law in areas of unrest. Though Davis claimed to be fighting for liberty, his actions painted a darker picture. His government supported the continued expansion of slavery into new territories, passed laws to keep enslaved people in bondage, and brutally suppressed any signs of rebellion among the enslaved population. As the war turned against the South, Davis became increasingly isolated. He refused to consider any peace that included emancipation or reunification on Northern terms. Even as General Robert E. Lee warned of collapse, Davis clung to a doomed vision of victory. In April 1865, as Union troops entered Richmond, Davis fled. He was eventually captured in Georgia and imprisoned for 2 years. Though indicted for treason, he was never tried. Some believed a trial would tear the country apart. Others feared he'd be seen as a martyr. After his release, Davis remained unrepentant. He wrote a memoir, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, in which he defended secession and slavery. He toured the South, receiving adulation from ex-Confederates, who saw him as a symbol of the lost cause. To his supporters, Davis became a sacred figure and old soldier standing firm in defeat, a man who never surrendered in spirit. Statues were erected. His legacy was entwined with Southern pride and post-war revisionism. But to the rest of the nation and especially to African Americans, Davis represented something much darker. The man who led a rebellion to preserve slavery, who defended human bondage with moral certainty, and who never acknowledged the horror of the system he fought to protect. Jefferson Davis died in 1889. At his funeral in New Orleans, tens of thousands mourned him. But the country he had tried to create, the Confederate States, was gone, discredited by war, rebellion, and racial tyranny. His life remains a study in contradictions, a man of dignity who defended the indefensible, a patriot to a cause rooted in oppression, a leader whose stubbornness ensured defeat. In the end, Jefferson Davis didn't just lose a war, he helped define the moral failure of an entire era. 4. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a man who lived by violence, rose through brutality, and left behind a legacy soaked in blood and terror. Revered by some for his battlefield prowess and reviled by others as a war criminal and white supremacist, Forrest is perhaps the most controversial figure to emerge from the Confederacy. His story is not just about the Civil War, it's about how hate finds new shapes long after the war is over. Born in 1821 in Tennessee into a poor frontier family, Forrest had little formal education, but what he lacked in schooling, he made up for in cunning, aggression, and sheer will. Before the Civil War, he amassed a fortune as a cotton planter, real estate speculator, and most notoriously as a slave trader. Forrest operated one of the largest slave markets in Memphis, personally buying and selling thousands of black men, women, and children. He became one of the wealthiest men in the South, and his wealth was built directly on human suffering. When the Civil War erupted, Forrest joined the Confederate Army as a private, but within months, he was a lieutenant colonel. His rise was meteoric, and for good reason. He was a brilliant, ruthless cavalry commander. Though untrained in military theory, Forrest had an instinct for warfare. He was aggressive, unpredictable, and charismatic. He led lightning raids, cut off Union supply lines, and outmaneuvered experienced generals. One Union commander famously said, "Forrest must be hunted down and killed if it costs 10,000 lives and bankrupts the federal treasury." But his genius on the battlefield was overshadowed by one of the most horrifying incidents in Civil War history, the Fort Pillow Massacre. In April 1864, Forrest's forces attacked the Union garrison at Fort Pillow, Tennessee, which was occupied by both white and black Union troops. After a brief battle, the Union soldiers attempted to surrender. What followed was not an honorable acceptance of surrender, but a slaughter. Forrest's men killed over 200 soldiers, many of them black after they had laid down their arms. Eyewitness accounts from survivors described Confederate soldiers bayoneting wounded men, setting bodies on fire, and shouting racial slurs. Black soldiers were given no quarter, and the massacre became a rallying cry for the Union Army. Forrest denied responsibility, claiming it was a battlefield confusion, but the evidence, including statements from his own men, paints a grim and deliberate picture. After the war, Forrest returned to the South, but he didn't fade into obscurity. Instead, he took on a new and far more sinister role, the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Founded in 1865, the Klan was a secret terrorist organization that sought to undermine Reconstruction and restore white supremacy through violence and fear. Under Forrest's leadership, the Klan organized lynchings, whipped freedmen, burned black churches, and assassinated Republican leaders. Forrest publicly denied involvement, but again, the records say otherwise. Congressional testimony, Klan members' own accounts, and multiple Southern newspapers linked him directly to the early activities of the Klan. He helped structure the group, giving it a military-style hierarchy, and urged a campaign of racial terror. The Klan operated with impunity across the South, effectively functioning as a shadow government. By the 1870s, as national sentiment turned against the Klan and federal troops intervened, Forrest claimed to have disbanded the group. Whether that was true or just a public relations maneuver is still debated, but by then, the damage was done. The Klan had already altered the course of Reconstruction, helping to usher in Jim Crow laws and decades of segregation and racial oppression. Later in life, Forrest tried to rehabilitate his image. He made vague gestures toward racial reconciliation, including a curious speech to a black audience in which he called for unity. But to many, these were empty words from a man who had already unleashed a reign of racial terror. He died in 1877, and over the following century, a mythologized version of Forrest emerged in parts of the South. Statues were erected, schools and highways were named after him. He was praised for his military brilliance, and portrayed as a Southern patriot who had simply fought for his homeland. But the truth is harder. Forrest was a slave trader, a mass murderer, and the architect of one of America's first major hate groups. His legacy is not just a historical, debates a wound that still bleeds. Monuments to Forrest became flashpoints in the 21st century battle over Confederate symbols and white supremacy. His story forces Americans to reckon with the ways we remember our past and how we choose to forget. Nathan Bedford Forrest didn't just fight a war, he built a legacy of fear. And while time has buried his bones, it has not buried the consequences of his actions. 5. Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold's name has become synonymous with betrayal in American history. To call someone a Benedict Arnold is to accuse them of the ultimate act of treason. But who was the man behind the infamy? How did one of George Washington's most trusted generals become the most notorious traitor in the nation's founding narrative? His story is one of valor, bitterness, ambition, and catastrophic disloyalty. Born in 1741 in Norwich, Connecticut, Arnold came from a once prosperous family that had fallen into debt. His early life was marked by hardship and a desperate desire to reclaim honor and prestige. As a young man, he became a successful merchant, earning a reputation for boldness and independence. But underneath his charm and business acumen simmered a deep insecurity and craving for recognition. When the Revolutionary War broke out, Arnold was among the first to join the cause. His early campaigns were nothing short of heroic. He played a pivotal role in capturing Fort Tyrants in 1775 and led a harrowing expedition through the Maine wilderness to Quebec. Though that mission failed, Arnold's resilience earned him admiration and a promotion. At the Battle of Volquar Island and later Saratoga, his leadership helped stall British advances, turning the tide of war. Even when seriously wounded, he refused to leave the battlefield. But while Arnold's bravery was unmatched, his personality bred enemies. He quarreled constantly with fellow officers, defied orders, and believed that his contributions were underappreciated. He was repeatedly passed over for promotion and faced accusations of corruption and profiteering. As the war dragged on and newer generals received glory, Arnold's bitterness festered. In 1778, Arnold was appointed military governor of Philadelphia, a major role in the city torn by war. There, he lived extravagantly, socialized with British loyalists, and married Peggy Sheep, the daughter of a prominent Loyalist family. Many historians believe she played a key role in influencing his eventual betrayal. Though Arnold's resentment was already deep, by 1780, Arnold made his fateful move. Feeling slighted by Congress, drowning in debt, and convinced the American cause was faltering, he contacted the British. In exchange for money and a high-ranking position, he agreed to surrender the American fort at West Point, a vital military post on the Hudson River. The plan was nearly successful, but then fate intervened. British Major John Kyrene, papers that detailed Arnold's betrayal, was captured by American forces. When George Washington learned of the plot, he was stunned. Arnold fled to British lines just before he could be arrested, was hanged. Arnold was branded a traitor. The fallout was seismic. George Washington, who had once trusted Arnold deeply, was devastated. The Continental Army was enraged. For the fledgling nation, Arnold's treason became a unifying symbol, proof that betrayal lurked, even among the ranks of heroes. Arnold served the British for the remainder of the war, but never found the glory he sought. Though he led troops in Virginia and Connecticut, he was distrusted by the British, despised by Americans, and shunned even by Loyalists. His dreams of honor turned to ashes. After the war, Arnold moved to London, where he lived in relative obscurity. He tried to start businesses and remain politically active, but doors were closed to him. He died in 1801, reportedly tormented by his legacy. On his deathbed, he is said to have asked to be buried in his old American uniform. Benedict Arnold's story is more than a cautionary tale. It's a tragedy of ambition gone awry. He was a man of extraordinary talent and courage, but also one consumed by ego and insecurity. He fought valiantly for the American cause, then nearly destroyed it. In doing so, he became the very symbol of the betrayal he so bitterly felt. In the end, Benedict Arnold teaches us that patriotism is not merely about actions on the battlefield but about loyalty to ideals. He had the heart of a warrior, but the soul of an opportunist, and for that, history has never forgiven him. 6. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is the only president in American history to resign from office in disgrace. His name is forever linked to one word: Watergate. Yet his political career was one of astonishing highs before the catastrophic fall. From humble beginnings to the White House and eventually to political oblivion, Nixon's story is the quintessential American tragedy, marked by ambition, paranoia, brilliance, and betrayal. Born in 1930 in Yorba Linda, California, Nixon grew up in a modest Quaker household. His family struggled financially, and 2 of his brothers died young. These early hardships shaped Nixon's worldview, imbuing him with a relentless drive to succeed and a deep distrust of elites. He was intelligent, serious, and introverted, traits that would serve him well in law school and later politics. Nixon's political rise was meteoric. After serving in the Navy during World War II, he ran for Congress in 1946. He made a name for himself as a fierce and playing a key role in the Algar Hiss case that catapulted him to national fame. By 1950, he was in the Senate. Just 2 years later, he was chosen as Dwight D. Eisenhower's running mate. At age 39, he became the Vice President of the United States. During the 1950s, Nixon was seen as a political bulldog, loyal and always ready to fight the administration's enemies. He traveled extensively, gained foreign policy experience, and became known for his infamous Checkers speech, in which he defended his integrity and connected emotionally with the American people. The speech saved his political career. Nixon ran for president in 1960, but lost narrowly. John F. Kennedy. The televised debates exposed his nervous energy and awkward demeanor. Crushed but not broken, he made an ill-fated run for California governor in 1962. After losing, he famously told the press, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." It seemed his political career was over. But Nixon's story was far from finished. In 1968, riding a wave of backlash against civil unrest, the Vietnam War, and cultural upheaval, Nixon staged one of the greatest comebacks in American political history. He won the presidency, promising law and order, and a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. As president, Nixon achieved significant successes. He opened diplomatic relations with China, ushering in a new era of global politics. His administration pursued with the Soviet Union, signed arms control treaties, and oversaw the end of American involvement in Vietnam. Domestically, he established the Environmental Protection Agency and supported desegregation efforts in Southern schools. But beneath these achievements was a deepening darkness. Nixon was obsessed with loyalty, secrecy, and power. He saw enemies everywhere in the press, in Congress, even within his own administration. He created an internal White House unit called the Plumbers to plug information leaks and gather dirt on opponents. In June 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. Initially dismissed as a minor scandal, the story quickly unraveled. Journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post uncovered a web of deceit that led all the way to the Oval Office. As investigators followed the money trail, it became clear that the break-in was part of a broader campaign of political espionage and sabotage, directed by the Nixon administration. The White House denied involvement, but Nixon's own paranoia led him to record conversations in the Oval Office. These tapes would become his undoing. In 1973 and 1974, the Watergate scandal consumed the nation. Senate hearings revealed shocking abuses of power, illegal political blackmail, hush money, and a president desperate to protect himself. Nixon fought back, invoking executive privilege, firing special prosecutors, and stonewalling Congress. But when the Supreme Court ordered Nixon to release the tapes, the truth became undeniable. One tape, recorded just days after the break-in, revealed Nixon discussing how to obstruct the FBI's investigation. This smoking gun tape destroyed his political support, facing certain impeachment and conviction. Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974. The next day, he left the White House with his trademark wave and a forced smile. Vice President Gerald Ford assumed the presidency and soon issued Nixon a full pardon, sparking national outrage but also helping the country move forward. Nixon spent the rest of his life trying to rehabilitate his image. He wrote memoirs, gave interviews, and offered foreign policy advice to future presidents. In time, he regained some respect as a statesman, especially in foreign affairs. But the shadow of Watergate never left him. Richard Nixon died in 1994, aged 81. At his funeral, leaders from both parties praised his intellect and service. But for most Americans, his legacy remains one of shame and scandal. Nixon was a man of extraordinary political talent. He rose from nothing to become the most powerful man in the world. He could have been remembered for his achievements in diplomacy and governance. Instead, he is remembered for deceit, criminality, and the near collapse of American trust in government. He didn't just betray the law, he betrayed the very ideals he once claimed to uphold. In his downfall, America learned a painful lesson, that even in democracy, power can corrupt absolutely.